Welcome. You are entering into a strange dimension. A dimension where narratives from across space and time come together. Narratives that could have, might have, or should have been all exist here in one space. This is CineCasters Ultimate Timeline.
How are we doing this? Is this like are we doing this like a normal CineCasters episode, but we're just going to talk about something we think
I think we're
going to
do it like a bonus cast, but we might, I don't know.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting because we're doing something that we don't normally do, which is we are sitting down specifically to talk about something that we're not going to deconstruct it. I mean, we're going to deconstruct it more to just.
I'm just going to assume that we already started. We're already in it. Like this just started.
I think we are.
Yeah.
We're in it. Yeah. This is we're in the loop now.
I think it's essentially the way that I thought about it was like I wanted to do an episode of CineCasters with the caveat that I didn't want to do a repitch.
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing because I think we were both like, this movie is unreal. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're talking about Palm Springs.
Palm Springs. Yeah. Oh yeah. So maybe just a quick introduction for our listeners, assuming we're doing this now.
Yeah.
Palm Springs. So the movie that just came out this past year on Amazon Prime. It's on Amazon Prime right now. That's where I watched it. It's got Andy Samberg.
Andy Samberg.
And
J.K. Simmons
is in it. And
I don't know who the other actress is.
I'm going to look it up right now because she has a very unique, distinctive name. Kristen Milioti.
Okay, yeah. And then there's a couple of other famous people in there, like the groom and the bride are both like famous for various things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and Peter Gallagher as well. He's actually he's pretty well established too.
Oh, he did the father of the bride,
the dad. Yeah. He was pretty I mean, he had a number of roles back to back in the '90s in some great movies. But yeah, so I saw this. Xenia recommended this to me, and we did one of those like viewing parties.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away. And as soon as we finished watching it, I told her, I was like, Andrew is going to love this. And I messaged you right away.
And I watched it that night, so I must have watched it like literally hours after you.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I was surprised at how quickly you jumped on it.
You had recommended it, and I was dicking around for sandwiches that evening, and I was just like, you know what? Yeah, I got time. So I watched it, and I was blown away. Like, I was like, yo, this movie buries its lead so well. Like, in all the trailers and whatnot, it's like, oh, okay. Like, it gives up the fact, basically, that you're in a kind of Groundhog Day time loop. Mm-hmm. But then, like, as soon as he got shot with the arrow and Sarah starts, like, freaking out, I was like, yo, this is hilarious. Like, I was laughing so hard because I think the reason that it works is because when you understand that the whole plot conceit is that it's a infinite time loop of that single day, you realize, like, just like we did in Groundhog Day, that there's no consequences to any of the choices you make. So the fact that he starts to get shot and she's freaking out, if you're in on the joke, it's hilarious.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially, and because it's Andy Samberg and he has a particular, like, you know, cadence and way of playing things off. Oh, he's just like gets shot with the arrow and she's like, what the fuck, freaking out, and he's just like, Roy, I thought it was you, and you're just like, that is not an appropriate response.
Yeah,
but of course for him it would be so funny.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I loved about it too. There were moments where you really got a bit of that. There's that Andy Samberg just over the top ridiculousness. Yeah. I'm thinking specifically, one of my favorite gags is there's a bomb in the cake. Don't worry, everybody, I was a bomb expert.
In a past life.
And takes a crossbow.
And Sarah's like dressed up as like a pirate.
But it really took the time loop genre, subgenre, let's say, and really ran with it and did something really creative.
Yeah, it did
something with it.
Some really cool things. I think for me there was sort of like two basic themes going on, and the two basic themes were basically like both related back to the time loop. The first was that Sarah and Niall's relationship their relationship is entirely, I guess, paralleled with the time loop. So like everything that happens in the time loop, I think represents marriage, quote unquote. Not the wedding, the marriage, right?
Yes.
And so
or like a long-term
relationship. Yeah, any long-term relationship. If we want to split hairs about it, but yeah. And it like they even, if you look at it, you could even say like they go through the phases of like a relationship where they're like first meeting, and then they have like a honeymoon period, and then they start to like freak out, and one of them gets scared, but then like at the end, like one of them wants a change and the other one doesn't. Like these are classic universal kind of things that happen in relationships. It's just all bound to this wacky, outrageous, time loop. So, and I thought that was so interesting because it was like their relationship was about, when you say like till death do us part and you can't die, what does that mean? Exactly. Like this kind of eternity. Like, do people really, in a more grounded way, do people really know what they're signing up for when they like get married? You know what I mean? When they enter into a relationship, you're like, yeah, sure, I want to do this forever, and you're like, okay, but like how long truly is forever?
Yeah.
And I think that actually really works for this movie. Really
exactly
works. The other theme, I guess, was sort of just classic existentialism, particularly in like the Nietzschean way, which is where he comes up with his idea of the eternal hell, the eternal recurrence is what he calls it, like just doing the same thing over and over again, and that's where your hell comes from. And then we can move into like the myth of Sisyphus, where it becomes, well, if you know this is going to happen, and this is very Niles. Niles is like, it doesn't matter what's in the past. It's just, you just go with it. And then finally, I think in J.K. Simmons and Roy's character, we get the full idea of like, he has come to peace. You know what I mean? He has found what he calls his Irvin, right? Because that's where he is, in Irvin, Texas. But he's found his peace. He's like, every day is the same thing. My wife asks if I make tuna, and I marinate it, and then little Billy or whatever is over there watering his dog shit. and I was like, see, this is supposed to be like the Sisyphean peace that Camus talks about, and other existentialists have talked about too. You have to find like peace. You must imagine Sisyphus happy in this eternal recurrence. Yeah, that one I don't think landed quite as well.
I definitely think it's there. I mean, that was one thing that I was really. I mean, you picked up on basically the two things that I felt I connected with. But I loved how in every scene, or it felt like in many scenes, they were really able to unpack. It was, remember like last time when we were talking about Oblivion, and how it didn't really fully explore all the nuances of an idea and all the complications and all the, what would be the real consequences of cloning somebody, right? And in this case, it took the idea of what would it actually be like to be stuck in a time loop and explored it, I think, to the fullest extent it could have in a 30-minute, 90-minute piece.
And I was laughing for most of it.
Me too. I thought it was hilarious.
What I really think works is, I mean, obviously, so Camus would always talk about the absurdity of the universe, right? He says, being alive and having no purpose, but being forced as human beings to look for a purpose, that's the cosmic joke. That's absurd. Life is absurd. It's filled with these contradictions and pain and suffering, and I mean, that's not all it is, but like that was his point of view. And absurdity, I think, is hilarious, especially when you lean into it. And so some of the things that they go into, like you were just saying, this whole like, I was a bomb guy in a, you know what I mean? Like, he's got a fucking crossbow and there's a bomb planted in the cake, and Sarah's dressed up as a fucking pirate with a terrible Australian accent. Like, that kind of and it works. It's so funny. It's so funny. And the kind of crazy stuff they get up to is funny. But I did think the existentialism, I think, landed, but I think it landed less well, because at one point in time, Niles talks about like the consequences and morals in existentialism, because he talks about like living without consequences. That's Niles' whole shtick, right? How do we live without consequences? But then he says, like, when you do other things to other people, being the cause of terror, you are like, it's not just about what you do to other people, because you don't want to cause other people terror or pain because you also have to live with it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was one scene in particular that I was thinking about that really resonated with me, was how it took something and really explored what that would actually mean. Because that's another thing, is you could then go, okay, well, what would then stop you from doing all these things? And then he lays it out and says, like, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but then you have to live with the consequences of it, because you did it, yeah, and you can't forget those things. Which I found really, really interesting.
I thought it was a great way to like ground like a return to ethics, particularly like I guess Kantian ethics, but a return to ethics, like how you treat others affects you, not just how you treat them, particularly when you're in an inconsequential environment, which nihilism, like true nihilism, is supposed to be inconsequential, because nothing matters, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess if you were a true nihilist, you would say like, well, nothing matters, even like the effects that it has on me, none of that will matter. But if you can't die, like if you're in an eternal nihilistic state, then you can't die, which means it does matter.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and it was so interesting to kind of balance those viewpoints and have a character. And I like that you brought up Sisyphus, because that was what I was thinking about. It is very Sisyphean. I mean, it's kind of anything that's dealing with the continuous struggle in one way or another. Sisyphus is always going to come up, obviously, but it's interesting how they balanced that within the framework of this kind of absurd sci-fi comedy. But I think, and then going back to what you were saying before, the reason it all works is because it's really about their relationship, and it's really about what it means to be in love with somebody, and
exploring that through the absurdity of forever, truly forever.
Exactly. Because actually, that's one thing that I've learned in writing science fiction is, even if you have a concept that's interesting, and even if it inherently asks certain questions about, it explores certain concepts, if it isn't grounded in something that is very human, and I think specific to relationships, I don't necessarily mean romantic relationships, but just like people in general and how we connect with each other, I don't think it's going to work. And I think that's something that this movie does really well.
Yeah, you do have to connect it back to the human aspect. Like, otherwise it becomes almost like a philosophical dissertation, which has its place. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, for sure.
As somebody who writes philosophy, sci-fi and philosophy often go hand in hand. But if you have a weird concept and go like, what are the ramifications of X, Y, Z? And then you like lay them out, it becomes like, wow, this is a really neat idea. But without some kind of human element, it's going to make for a shitty TV show or movie or kind of media experience. It just becomes like a thought experiment in essay form, or maybe an entertaining thought experiment. But it's not a, like, if somebody made a movie of the trolley problem that wasn't educational, because there are educational movies of the trolley problem, but if somebody made a movie of the trolley problem but didn't have like inherent characters you care about. Like, if you made the people on the two different tracks of the trolley problem, like the 10 and the 1 on the two different tracks of the trolley problem, it would be like totally different, because you'd have I mean, the best example I can give of that is there's an episode of in the second season of The Good Place where they literally do that, and it's great. And I love that episode.
It's my favorite episode of that show.
I have a whole, this is a thing that I'm going to write about it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, the philosophical concept has to be rooted in something human. We need, I guess, if you want to like pull it down to its most basic idea, if you want to tell a kind of story that asks those questions, you need a vehicle to do it. And your vehicle has to be a character. Yeah,
exactly.
And if you're using your character, and I'm simplifying, if you're using your character just as a vehicle, then it's not going to work either. Your character has to be three-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and what's interesting here is, the way in which you have one character who's essentially lived in this world and has become familiar with it and explored all of the implications of it, and because normally what would happen, and he's kind of the one that as the audience, we start with his point of view, and he's the one who brings us into it. And usually what would happen, like I'm thinking in the case of something like Groundhog Day, or another time loop movie that I think is excellent, Live, Die, Repeat.
Yep. Oh, great movie.
And that also.
Oh, it's also called Edge of Tomorrow. If anyone's wondering.
That was that one. Yeah, it changed titles.
Changed titles. Yeah.
Yeah, but yes, that is the same movie. What's interesting with all three of these movies is they all deal with relationships, specifically with like.
There's another one that's like a preteen, not a preteen, more like a coming of age kind of movie about kids in high school. It does something. It's called Premature, I believe.
Okay, I'm actually not familiar with that.
It's the same idea, this time loop, except it's a bit more of like a raunchy comedy, but it deals with relationships the same way. It's about a kid who's in high school, and every time he ejaculates, he wakes back up in the morning.
Oh, that's hilarious!
It is really funny. So he's trying to figure out he's trying to figure out like what's going on, and throughout the whole day, he's trying to figure out like how does he get out of this, and so he goes for as long as he can without. And then he winds up having a wet dream and waking back up. You know what I mean? Like
that's like, so funny.
But it is a coming of age. So
I've got to check this out. I love that concept.
It's not as well thought out as this. It is a bit more of like a coming of age story kind of thing. Like who's he going to be? What's going to happen when he goes off to college? What are his friendships going to be like? But it's fun. It's a fun movie. So.
Okay. Yeah. No. I just love that concept.
Yeah.
That is brilliant.
I also think that Palm Springs does something really well in that it deals with different people's idea of purpose when they're faced with the fact that there is no purpose. So each of the characters we meet sort of goes through this kind of idea of what their purpose is. So when we first meet Niles, he's like the perfect hedonist. He lives that inconsequential with like a no consequence kind of living, and he does it like that's just how he lives, and he does it, and that's the way he wants to live, and everything is about the pursuit of not baser necessarily, but just the pursuit of living, right, in a hedonistic kind of way. When we first meet Sarah, when she gets stuck in the time loop, she's going through almost like the stages of grief.
Right.
Like desperately trying to figure it out and then slowly comes to terms with it. But then like other characters like Roy, before Roy comes to his own kind of like nirvana over this reoccurrence, he is consumed with his need for vengeance against Niles, and like that becomes his purpose. It's not really explored, but if you really think about it, it's like this need for vengeance becomes Niles' purpose, or becomes Roy's purpose, because Roy blames Niles for it.
Right. Yeah.
Now, Roy is not a character in the same way that Niles and Sarah are. It really is a character piece for those two characters in their relationship. But like, I think that's really interesting to see like what is the purpose of each of these characters. Sarah, at the beginning, is kind of using this like hedonistic way that Niles has as a means of escaping her own guilt of what she's done. Right? Spoilers. But a means of escaping like what she's done, what she feels guilty over. What I also think is interesting is that Niles, we don't actually get a lot of like character background for Niles. He's only, for us in the audience, he only exists as part of the time loop, and there's no way to know who he was before. Because he never gives any of that. And he even says, like, I don't know how truthful this is, because Niles isn't always like a great character in terms of delivering the truth, but he says, I don't even remember. Which makes me think like he's either lying for whatever purpose, because he thinks it doesn't matter, as he stated, or he is actively doesn't remember, like it's been so long, which is possible too, because this movie plays with time across massive spans.
Right. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I mean, going back to one of the other things you talked about, is it talks about, for me, I think why I gravitated with it specifically was the whole notion of eternity and what does that mean?
Yeah.
And when you really think about, because there's also an implication in there that what gives our lives meaning is the fact that there is there is a development, there is a change over time. Like when he goes to see Roy talks about like how I thought I wanted this day to last forever. Because you have kind of two starting points. You have Andy Samberg. It's implied that at the beginning he's going, like before the time loop, he's reluctantly going to this wedding.
Yeah.
Things in his personal life may not be going well. We don't really know. But with Roy, you get the sense that he says like, this is like being the best day ever. I want to do this over and over and over again. But when he actually ends up getting that, what he comes to realize is that, oh, but then all these other things that I looked forward to, I'm now going to miss out on. I can't walk my daughter down the aisle. I can't watch my kids graduate.
That dog shit will never bloom into a beautiful shit place.
Exactly. And so there's also this, because this is something for me coming from my religious upbringing, is the whole idea of eternity is something that's always been somewhat of a fascination to me, and also equally terrifying for the implications of that. And that's something that was picked up here that I really connected with. And it's interesting though, because you have Sarah on one end, like who really wants to escape it, and you have Niles who's become so used to it that he's almost in some sort of reluctant way come to embrace it.
Yeah.
And I like how the solution to it, the other thing too, in terms of just a basic structure writing thing, is that she actually, like, the characters are able to figure out how to fix it. It's this really kind of ridiculous way, and it's so over the top and definitely stretched beyond the point of belief. But I mean, if I'm willing to accept that it's an infinite time loop, why not? But basically the fact that it's not some, because I always felt like with Groundhog Day, it was, I hate to say it, maybe I have to go read.
All of a sudden,
it is a little bit.
It works now, and it's like, but why?
Exactly, it's a little too convenient. Whereas with this, it feels like they actually are able to earn it. But the reason I also think it works is because it's tied directly to them and their relationship. And so it's not building up to, oh, are they going to get out? Aren't they going to get out? It's are they going to decide to try and make this work?
Yeah, so, I almost feel like at the ending, we get the ending and we actually see them outside of the loop.
Uh-huh.
I liked that because I thought it was hilarious. And one of the reasons I liked that is because Niles says, well, I better go pick up my dog.
Yeah.
And the reason I liked that is because Sarah's like, you never mentioned you had a dog. And it's so like, even though they've been together for eternity, they're still learning new things about each other.
Right.
Which is exactly like how that works in a relationship. You're constantly learning new things about, because the only person you know for real is yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like from a relationship standpoint, it's like, yes, that's exactly what is going on, right? Mm-hmm. And it's done really, really funny. Like she's like, oh my goodness. But the reason I didn't like it is because I felt like the point of the story was supposed to be about their relationship. So I almost feel like once it explodes, it doesn't matter whether they wind back up in the same loop or whether they made it out. I felt like it should have been left ambiguous.
I'm glad you say that, because I feel the same way actually. If I was to have maybe one very nitpicky thing, if I was, like if someone had handed it to me and be like, okay, well, like what? Like, okay, this is our rough cut or our fine cut. What would you change? I'd be like, I would just lose the ending. I'd have it like the thing explode.
Well, I know why the ending was there, because it works for relationships. So a lot of this, what I find is like a lot of this, I think, is rooted in like relationship theory and sociology and psychology, and that's not my forte. But like the way that they're like, Niles even says he's like codependent, like the way that they like talk about each other, deal with each other, like they're both dysfunctional in their own way, and like they still manage to come together. I wish I did know more about like the sociology and psychology of relationships and the theories behind that, because I'm sure there's tons to pull out there. That's not my field, right? So I do think like there's a reason for that being in there, that ending, but I do feel like the ambiguity would have been just as solid, because and I one of the things that was weird is it seemed to me like Niles was scared of like blowing up because that they might die. I guess maybe it would have been better if it had come across like he was scared because what if they did make it out?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But as opposed to like, because the only consequences would have been that they wake up in the same day.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I think it would have worked better if they had like, if Niles had really pushed, like, she's like, if Sarah, I think this kind of happened, but it wasn't clear, where if Sarah had said something like, you know, the worst that's going to happen is we wake up and we're still stuck in the same day together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Niles says, yeah, but what if we make it out? That's what scares him, is what if we make it out? Yeah,
exactly. Right? Yeah, yeah.
Or more accurately, like, what if they make it out but are exploded, you know, masses of nothing because they're literally blowing themselves up inside of the wormhole or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But I mean, I think that's a moot point. Really, the point has to be like Niles is afraid. So like in classic relationships, what puts a strains on relationships is that, you know, in a relationship, two people want the same thing until one of them doesn't, and the other one is like afraid to move on with that person.
Right.
So not that they don't want that person anymore. That's not what I'm talking about. Like, so in this case, Sarah no longer wants to live within the universe, and Niles is fine with it. He's like, I'm fine with living in this eternal hell if I have you with me. But Sarah's like, I'm not fine with this. I need to leave it because every morning she wakes up with her husband or her sister's fiance.
Her sister's, yeah.
Yeah, and so she's like riddled with guilt constantly every time she wakes up. And so she wants to leave, Niles doesn't, and this causes strain in a relationship. This is classic. And so at the end we see Niles be like, okay, like I'm willing to give this a try, but he's scared, you know. He wants to keep things the way they are. Sarah doesn't. This is basic strain on any relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that works really well. Here's the problem that I have with this movie.
Okay.
Earlier, Niles had talked about, we're talking about eternity here. So the problem is that there is actually like an entrance and exit to this eternity. In that we know, this is nitpicky and loopholey, but we know that Niles can bring people into his eternal hell, which means that he chooses not to morally and ethically because he's like, I can't subject another person to this. But like, he could indefinitely just keep adding people into his hell every time he gets bored. He could just be like, oh, let's add a new person and see what that does.
Yeah.
So, like, he doesn't because it's morally and ethically. So that's fine. But we've established that he doesn't do that. So it's not a real eternal hell because he can change up what's happening. He has the ability to bring new factors into the equation, which would change up how eternal the recurrence is, right?
Right, okay.
Hence Sarah's introduction. But he chooses not to do that because of the moral facets. That's fine. However, at the end, he leaves with Sarah, and neither of them make any effort or amends to try and bring Roy back.
Did you watch the end credit scene?
Oh, maybe I didn't. If there's
okay. There is a scene like halfway through the credits.
Okay.
Actually, I think it's after the credits where Roy shows up at the wedding.
Yeah.
And he goes to talk to Niles, and he's like, "Hey, I got the note from your girlfriend."
Oh, okay.
And Niles is like, "What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about." The implication being that it worked.
Okay.
And Niles and so Roy is now, he's like, "Oh, okay, there is a way out." Because I remember thinking that same thing.
Okay, no, I missed that. Okay, because I was like, oh, that's really bothering me because I understand like thematically this is trying to do this like relationship through eternity, like in the actual implications of forever, and it works really well. But then it also having that ending where it's just the two of them puts them at odds with the existential idea that they had presented because they're leaving Roy behind.
Yeah, because I remember thinking that too when I was watching it. I was like, well, why wouldn't they at least make some effort to be like, hey, you can get out of this too?
And also,
even though
it's weird that it had to be that night.
Right.
Like the way Sarah talks about it, she's like, it's got to be tonight. I'm like, hey, if you can, like, it might take you a whole day to go and see Roy, but like, it's not like you don't have the time.
Right, yeah, exactly. I remember thinking that too. I mean, that's something I think I think it works because what it does is it ends up putting pressure on Niles. Now,
well, yeah,
yes,
when she makes the decision to go, that's fine, but it also feels like she's made a deadline for herself.
Right.
Which is weird because when she shows up to Niles, she's like, I'm leaving tonight. And I'm like, and you haven't told Roy?
Right.
You know what I mean? So if she's leaving tonight, that's fine. But I would put my affairs in order and then be like, I'm leaving tonight, whether you're with or without me.
Right.
Which includes like letting Roy know, because there's like ethical dilemmas there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think with the end credit scene, there's the implication that she had let Roy know. At some point, it's undisclosed as to when it would happen.
Did she let him? But like, how did that work? Because we're never given details.
Well, now you're thinking about it way more detail than I think you need to be. It's like she did at some point. She sent him a message at some point, and he got it. And then she decided it was time to go.
But did it explain like how to get out, or was it just like, we're leaving, bye?
No, he basically says the note, do you think it will work? He goes up to Niles do you think it will work? And then Niles is like, doesn't recognize him, and he goes, and then you get the shot of J.K. Simmons going, okay, like reaction shot of him going, okay, I think this is gonna work.
Okay, cool. Oh, now that's cool. I kind of wish I'd seen that. Okay, I'm on board now.
Yeah. So I mean, because I could see how that would, without that, I could see how that would kind of detract. And it is interesting because it's interesting that they would fit it after the credits.
I think I would have put it in before.
Yeah.
I think it would have been interesting to see like Niles and Sarah want to go. Or Niles is like caught in between, but Roy is like at that point in time is like, no, I don't want to go, but I know how. So when I'm ready to leave, I can try it.
Yeah.
Because then we can have like Niles caught in between the two.
Right.
Because we can have like Roy be like, I made my peace, and Sarah being like, I'm getting out of here, and Niles can be like, where do I go? And then when he chooses to go with Sarah, because I do feel like the whole impact of him leaving with Sarah is the point of the movie in terms of this relationship theme we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So I think like I think that's more important thematically instead of having it as an end credit sequence, because I missed it. Right. And it bothered me, right?
Yeah. Well, no, that's a fair point. I mean, I think to put in a scene where they go to see Roy would have potentially slowed it down. Because I mean, at that point in the movie, it's basically.
But you could just have Roy show up, like send the letter, have Roy show up. You're leaving tonight, like, or what did you want to see? And she's like, we have a way out of here, and then he can be like, like I've made my peace now, and now you're asking me to go back into the turmoil.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see if there's an interview somewhere where they were asked about how that came about. Yeah. I'd be curious to hear what their logic was to do it that way. I mean, my best guess is it has something to do with the fact that maybe it was felt like Roy was no longer going to change anything with the dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah.
So it was better to just
from a character point of view, I like the way that it is. It works. I know exactly why.
Yeah. You know, I think I would have. I don't think I would have changed the thing that way. I do think, just for my own, I just personally like ambiguity with endings.
Yeah, me too.
And so I like the idea of leaving it. You know, whether they make it out or not is really irrelevant.
Yeah, it doesn't actually matter. The decision to go. And particularly Niles' decision to go with Sarah is more important than whether or not they made it out.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be kind of like the end of Truman Show. Like, you see Jim Carrey walk out of the dome. You don't know what happens next, but it's irrelevant. It's about him making the choice
to leave, and that kind of rail against his creator.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel like, I mean, and I don't think it was wrong, because it's a funny ending. Like, this family shows up, is like, hey, what the fuck are you doing in our pool?
Yeah, it is funny, and it shows like, it does show that they made it out, and that they're like trying to make this work on some degree.
Yeah, exactly. And your point about the dog too. I mean, that is a good point. Like, oh yeah, they spent it all in an eternity together, and still she didn't know about the dog. So there's like that, and I actually hadn't thought about it that way either. Yeah. So there is another layer with that as well. I also wonder, guess I hadn't considered.
Like, they spent so much time apart while they were in the time loop. I also wonder, like, you know, Sarah basically taught herself quantum physics over however long that might take. To a
that would have been several years.
Yeah,
easily.
To a point where she was like able to understand and have conversations with, you know, physicists and theoreticists that she could hold her own with, which makes me think like, if she'd spent that much time away from Niles, how much would her personality change? because she's learning and taking in new information.
Right.
And we know that they're not static people, right? It's not as like they remember everything that's happened to them up until this point. They change and grow. We see this in Niles through his character arc. We see this in Roy through his character arc. We see Sarah make decisions about her character arc, which means that they're actively changing even though they're in the time loop, which makes me think like when Sarah goes to learn this kind of information, you know, the more education you have, the more critical thinker you become. I just wonder like how much of her personality would change so that Niles was eventually in love with the idea of the old her and no longer in love with the new her.
Oh, right. Well, that would have been a very interesting twist and a very different movie.
Yeah.
And probably would have made it a lot longer.
I'm like throwing in my own ideas about how time works and how I love time travel because I like to nitpick about this kind of shit. But, yeah. Do I think that this movie needed any of that? No. Do I think it's a question that I want to ask? Hell yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing. I mean, in terms of writing something like this, because you sit down and you it's this challenge of how do you keep it focused. And what is interesting, and we were talking about some of the other time loop movies, how they do focus on relationships generally. And I was thinking specifically of Live, Die, Repeat because it asks a similar question to this one, which is. What would it be like to know someone, although it's a one-sided time loop. So essentially it gets to a point where he's known everything about her, but she doesn't know anything about him.
Yeah, but she understands. What's interesting about that is they've both been through the time loop thing, but at different times. So she understands why things are happening. She just can't explain them from his point of view. Because we find out later on that she's actually experienced the time loop as well. He just happened. He's the one who's experiencing it now.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet they still somehow start a relationship. That still weirded me out.
Well, the thing for me in that movie, the thing that I specifically liked about that film was the moment when they're about to go and do. It's like right at the climax, and they're about to go do the thing and beat the bad guy, and they're talking. They're having their final exchange. And she says, like, oh, you're something to the effect of, you're a really fascinating person. I really wish I could have gotten to know you better. And there's a moment where he doesn't say anything and it's all on his face. And he's trying, you could tell he's trying to find the words to be like, oh, you have no idea.
No idea.
Like, and that I like that movie specifically for that moment.
Yep.
Because it asked a very interesting question, which to me was like, what would it be like to be in that position where you are so like someone and clearly there's something there, but it's you have all this access that they don't have. And so, but in this case it's it's obviously it's a very different movie, and it asks, it's not even it is actually a very different question, but it really is more like, what is it like to be in love, and then asking that question of like for forever, what taking that idea of till death do us part and just taking it to the absolute extreme, which is you don't die, and what is that like?
And how do you change and grow over the course of forever?
Yeah, exactly. And then of course all the other the ethical implications, and then the how you have Niles. I like that he's named Niles.
Yeah, I know. I thought about that too. I was like, oh, it's gotta be a thing.
I know, it's definitely intentional. It's almost too obvious, but again, I mean, the movie's so campy and like there's some elements about it where it embraces the absurdities that, I mean, I don't mind. In fact, I quite like it. I like that the movie kind of revels in those things.
Yeah.
Like the whole, I mean, there's the one scene where she's asking him about like, so who have you slept with? And he
even lists off all these people, but even lists off her dad. And
exactly.
Like, what are we doing? She's like, oh no, really? And he's like, nah, I was just fucking with you. Like, that's so funny. Or
exactly.
Even the scene that's serious when they crush J.K. Simmons with the car. They crush Roy with the car, and then Niles gets tased in the eyeball, and they're like sitting across from each other, and Roy's like crushed spine, like bleeding out, and he's like, "Who the fuck is she?" It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's a real, like, there's this cutaway to him, like, writhing in pain on the ground, and it's quite dark, actually.
Because I think the movie is trying to show us in a comedic way, like, there are consequences. Like, you do and can cause pain, particularly to the three of them. The three of them can cause pain because they don't forget. They remember.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the movie's kind of predicated on that.
Yeah.
Like, on the fact that they have to remember, because that means there is consequences. Like, Niles can't wake up when he says the wrong thing to Misty. He just wakes up the next morning and can move on with his day, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas when he says the wrong thing to Sarah, that's forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that was another thing that I thought was interesting with the time loop movies. The characters can remember what happened before. I mean, obviously, like, you couldn't do it because otherwise you wouldn't be able to have a movie about it otherwise. But I was thinking, like, how that's interesting, like, that's what would it be like to have a movie? I don't know how you could do this, but one where it is a time loop, but the characters are unaware of it.
Yeah. That'd be then it wouldn't really be a time loop then.
Well, see, exactly, but then it
winds up. Well, I mean, there's already is a movie that's that. It's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Okay.
So the original ending of the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was that Kate Winslet and Jim Carrey's characters have done this, like, and this is like the fourth or fifth time, and they've just keep forgetting. Right. So they're stuck in this eternal relationship loop that they keep forcing themselves into forgetting.
Right. Well, I think it's still implied.
Yeah.
It's not. It's because the final shot, if I remember that movie, is like it's a shot of them walking away. And then it cuts right back to them walking away, and it basically loops this shot over and over again. And I always took that as being the implication that that's what's going on.
And that's the way I took it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you would possibly do that, because if a character is unaware of it, then
it becomes an interesting way of exploring human habit and nature, but in a different way. It's not about relationships anymore. It's about predetermined
something very different.
Or predeterminism or habits, whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I really like this movie's interpretation of our introduction to the time loop. In the way that Niles is giving, like, the greatest speech ever, and the way he, like, moves through the party as though he's done it billions of times.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we see this in many time loop movies before. We see it in Live, Die, Repeat when he's, like, trying to get out of the army or whatever, and he's like, and then move left, and then duck down, and then, and he's like, and then roll on the ground out of the truck. And we see it in Groundhog Day when he, like, robs the bank.
Yeah,
People aren't paying attention. That kind of thing we've seen before, and so it's become a bit of a movie trope, and yet we're, instead of introducing, like, oh, you can do this in a time loop, it's just Niles straight up already can do it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is before, I mean, I'd gone into the movie knowing that's where it was going.
Yeah, so did I.
So it'd be interesting for someone to watch that, not knowing where it's going, to see, like, because it's interesting, because I was trying to imagine what it would be like not knowing where it was going, and there's enough to imply that it could be that, but it's weird enough and bizarre enough that you would be asking questions. You would be going, okay, this is not a typical wedding setup, because that's another thing too, is in the first 15 minutes there's not necessarily anything that gives away it's going to be a time loop movie. So how do you, if an audience is watching this, if they've just come on Amazon and they're watching this without any context, what's going to keep them engaged? And you have this, well, first of all, you have this really raunchy, bizarre sex scene at the beginning of the movie that's kind of awkward and disappointing and hilarious.
It's so funny.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But I think the reason this works is because we get that scene and you're like, what the fuck? Like, clearly he's bored or uninterested.
Yeah.
And then it also says a lot about their relationship.
Exactly.
About Misty and Niles' relationship. And then immediately we switch to Sarah's point of view at the wedding, looking at Niles. And it explores their relationship.
Yeah.
Or the fact that he thinks they have one and he seems to be directly talking to her. But we're seeing it from her perspective. It's a weird, like, everything about the first part of the movie is about relationships until Niles gets shot with the arrow.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like, what the fuck am I watching?
Yeah, exactly.
And then you understand it's a time loop, especially because Sarah's reaction is legitimate. The dude she was just about to bone just got shot twice with arrows. What the fuck? But Niles is just like, oh, it hurts so much, but also fuck you, Roy. That's not an appropriate reaction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like who ggets shot by an arrow and is like,
and
oh, why?
it.
Like, come on, man. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that from there we see the time loop from from Niles' perspective over again, and then from Sarah's perspective.
Yeah.
So like we're constantly like playing around with that. I also think the scene where Tala, I think Sarah's sister's name is Tala, where she like slips in the pool and loses her teeth.
Oh yeah.
That entire sequence is so funny.
Yeah.
Unreal funny. I also wonder what the rest of the timeline looks like. So if we think about this as a bigger picture, whereas I think about, instead of looping the same day over and over again, they're being transplanted from different timelines over and over again.
I was thinking about this too.
I wonder what do those timelines look like in the future? And, better question, do Niles and Sarah disappear from those timelines, or does like a version of their consciousness continue on from there?
Yeah, okay, see, that was the bit that I couldn't figure out, because I liked thinking that what happens...
Continues.
Okay, now we're getting into this. Yeah. What exactly. So what happens is when you go into the portal the first time, you vanish from that universe and you are put into another pretty much identical universe up to that point.
Yeah.
Where everything has stayed the same up to that point.
Yeah.
And everything for that day is subject to change based on the new variables that have been introduced. So then what happens, and
to the old timeline.
So the old timeline, I think, would continue without you. The very first one where you walk through the portal would continue without you.
Or does that mean when you leave the timeline, you return to that original timeline? Or do you just continue on with the one you were already in?
Oh, or do you move into another one? You know what? I suspect you return to the original one.
Yeah, because I feel like the universe... In the way that it works is always leading towards entropy is a thing, so it's always leading towards like a point of lowest potential energy, which means if there's like two consciousnesses, there's the one that you're currently inhabiting, and then you every time you die you like switch to a new loop where you maintain that consciousness, which means that there's a timeline that's missing you.
Right.
So when you leave the loop, you're no longer being transplanted to a new timeline, which will continue on without you, with different Niles, like almost like two consciousnesses inhabiting the same body. When you leave the time loop, they blew it up. They go back to their original time loop, because then there's like an even amount of Nileses and Sarahs throughout the universe.
Yeah.
This is just a guess. It could also be that we're like way overthinking it and it's just a loop of one day. I was just thinking like in terms of like actual science, how would that like physics and philosophy, how would that actually pan out? And so I was thinking it's the same, they're experiencing the same loop, but different timelines of that same day, which would continue on without them. And which would happen before them. It's one way to explain this, because a time loop in that like a single loop of one day over and over again doesn't happen in the universe. But traveling back in time to the same morning, right, of a day, but on a different timeline. Well, we know different timelines are a possibility, which means like that's one way you could explain it.
Yeah, that's how sort of I explained it.
Yeah,
that's how I always thought of Groundhog Day as well, because in Groundhog Day, in Groundhog Day actually implies that the one whatever timeline it was in on that day continues without him, because there's this scene where he like jumps off a building.
No, he steals the groundhog and jumps into a quarry and dies.
Yeah, and then it cuts to the morgue.
Yeah,
where she looks at his body. And she's like, yeah, that's him.
So that implies that even though he's dead, the timeline has continued on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think this is the same with Palm Springs.
Yeah. Now, there's nothing here to give that away. There's nothing that would...
This is just me being like, how can I apply my theories of time and time travel in the universe to make this a plausible thing.
And again, it's not really the point of the movie. In fact, what I love, when they get into the science of it, they literally just go, it's quantum science, quantum physics, and she did something, and she kind of goes, all her explanation is kind of this. It's probably based on some sort of scientific theory, but it's mostly just to like we understand that she figured it out, and they came up with something that's kind of ridiculous, but that's not really the point. It's not really about how it works. Like an episode of Star Trek or Twilight Zone would maybe explore like, oh, this is how it works.
So here's my alternate pitch. I know we said we weren't going to do this, but here's my alternate pitch. Just a short one, okay? So I know you said you would prefer ambiguity, but just hear me out, okay? They explode the cave, wind up out of it, and our after explosion scene, instead of them being chilling in the pool and exploring a new facet of their relationship with finding out about Niles' dog, instead they wake up. And the whole thing, the reason the way the loop works isn't because of time travel. It's because it's been a simulation of this single day over and over and over again. And they're actually already married, and this was marriage counseling.
Oh. Okay. Have you seen the Black Mirror episode, Hang the DJ?
I have not.
Okay. It's similar. I may have spoiled it for
whatever.
you.
That's okay.
It basically the whole episode essentially is very similar to what you described, actually. Because I like that idea too of it being a simulation.
But and that's how the loop works. Is everything just resets, and so like it's a simulation, and when they wake up, they're like, oh my god, like it's a simulation, but it worked. Like the marriage counseling worked because it forced them to interact with each other forever. Yeah. Except it wasn't forever. It was only within their mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the Black Mirror episode, there's a Black Mirror episode called Hang the DJ, which is essentially, it's about this couple. Well, there are these two people on a dating app, and the way this dating app works is it sets you up with someone, and it tells you how long you're going to be with this person.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And you have to, for whatever reason, you cannot disagree with it because it knows what's best.
Yeah.
So it's these two people, they meet and they clearly hit it off. They're like, okay, but they're immediately told it's only going to last like a week or something. And so they seem kind of surprised by this. But they go through it. They go through the motions, and they stay together for a week, and they leave each other thinking like, you get the feeling that was more than they feel like there was more there.
There's more that could have been there, but the thing says a week, so.
But that continues, and it's them. They go with other people, but they keep thinking about that other person, and they keep bumping into each other, and they keep going. Was the algorithm wrong? Do you want me to? Can I spoil the ending?
Yeah, go ahead. We're already here.
So basically, what happens in the end is they basically rebel against the algorithm, and they escape. And when they escape, what they discover was that they were in a simulation. And what happens is, so basically, they get together, and then it's determined that they're a simulation. And what you see is it was a simulation that was run over and over and over and over again to determine if they would actually beat the odds of the algorithm. And then it goes out, and it's these two people in the real world on dating apps, and it's these two people who meet each other in real life.
Whoa! So they weren't even like actually like a simulation of them in it. It was like they were using like a simulation of like, or even the characters were simulations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So basically, but the reason it works and the reason why it's kind of this. Some people were saying, I don't know if anybody was saying this, but at first it feels like, because Black Mirror usually ends on kind of a downer.
Yeah.
This episode seemed to be one where it was like, oh, they got together. I mean, it's still, you're like, oh, it was a simulation. It didn't matter. Like, but these two people who come together in the end. But you realize what it's really about is it's about two people. The irony of this simulation that's being run for compatibility to see if they would beat the simulation, and yet that's going to be the thing. It's still an algorithm that determines that they get together.
Yeah. But also,
so in the end,
also
it's
the fact
two people.
that, like, if I'm understanding correctly, like the two people that were like they're using the dating app, that means that there's a simulation, there's a simulated version of these two people in the dating app that were like used.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but the whole idea is that they're actually just as trapped, essentially, as these two people are.
Yeah.
So anyway, when you were describing your version of this movie, it was like, oh, that's kind of like the Black Mirror episode, which I would highly recommend. I mean, I think it's many people think it's one of the best, and I certainly think it is. It's excellent.
Yeah. I think that's a bonus cast or a special episode. I don't know. I didn't really want to do pitches because there was so much to deconstruct, and also I really like this movie, especially with this J.K. Simmons post-credits thing you're talking about that I miss. I'm happy with this movie the way it is. Go see it.
Yes, definitely. I would highly recommend this movie as well.
Yeah. Peace out.